We have an actual emergency.
Emergency podcast. Betty did a thing, so we gotta talk about it. Emergency podcast. It's an emergency. Emergency podcast. Shut up, hell yeah, shut up, hell yeah, shut up. Emergency podcast. It's an emergency.
Hey, a hearty hello to you all, and welcome to Emergency Podcast, the Austin FC podcast, where we are serious about the emergency this time. It happened. We were expecting it over the last few weeks. I thought it was going to be Monday rather than Sunday. I thought they were going to let Verdos have their day, but this morning, Austin FC has announced that they are parting ways with Josh Wolff, the only coach that this team has had ever since 2019, even before it became a club. And now the search is apparently on for a new head coach. They haven't announced an interim yet. I suspect that's going to be Davy Arnaud for the final game, the decision day game against Colorado. It's one game left in the season, but of course, doesn't really matter. They were officially eliminated from playoff contention last night with the loss to the Galaxy, something again that we were expecting for several weeks. I thought that was going to be the game that was going to ultimately do it, unfortunately. And here we are. It's Sunday, October 6th. It's a momentous day in Austin FC history. And I was driving my son to ACL when I got the news, when I got a text from Jeremiah Bentley asking what I was doing tomorrow afternoon. Moisés, where were you when you heard the news?
I was laying in bed, slowly getting up after sleeping in, putting in a very late shift last night. Well,
yeah, it was.
Relatively speaking. But yeah, for somebody who was still up at 4 a.m., frankly, I underslept a little bit. But 11:50 a.m., October 6th, is now a series of numbers in club history, as is, was it, let's see, 45, 30, 60? That was his final win.
Yeah, 45.
Draw.
The MLS regular season record. Yeah, there's obviously a few more games, Leagues Cup, right. CCL, lest we forget that there were CCL games in there as well. But yeah, basically, I have this in my article that I just put up a little bit ago. They got themselves, basically, Josh got himself to a 1.22 point per game record, which is below the Thomas Rongen line that we coined earlier this year. And it looks like, again, with playoffs this year, it looks like you need more than that level of performance to make the West playoffs, at least. So again, yeah, when he got the edict from Burrell at the start of the season that playoffs are a must, and this is the third of 4 seasons where he hasn't made the playoffs. Austin's the only team that has not made the playoffs. 2023 and 2024 combined. All other 13 West clubs have made the playoffs at least one of those 2 years. It seemed to be inevitable. And I think we had a sense last night, which you had asked a pretty interesting question, which got the leanings of a response. If you want to share that with everybody, and then we can just, again, this is going to be brief. We're going to do way more tomorrow night once we hear from Burrell, but we just want to get this out here and get something up since it is called Emergency Podcast and we do have one.
We committed to the name, and early on we decided we were going to commit to the bit, provided that something this momentous happened, that we would definitely mark the moment in time.
I am missing a movie for this, but
yeah,
duty calls.
I actually, I would roll us back a few weeks. I think the post-game press conference after the Vancouver loss is when we felt like that was definitely it. I would go back so far as the loss against Frisco that lost Austin Copa Tejas this year. When I saw Rodolfo Burrell briefly in the tunnel after the match, that did not look like a guy who was eager to retain his current manager. That is a guy who had I came from Man City, I came from a results-oriented club. These are not results. There are not excuses for this. That was not a man who saw that as a forgivable loss, is the way that it read to me. And he's been here a year and a half. People are still getting used to reading the guy. I feel like he is pretty friggin' transparent. And that said to me that Josh had probably a certain amount of time bought with the new players coming in to see some change in results, some difference in the trend lines. But once we hit that Vancouver game, to me, there was a marked difference in his bearing, in the way that he was positioning things, where it was legacy related. And to be clear, I'm not saying that he was trying to establish his glorious legacy that shall never be touched or tarnished or anything like that, but more, well, he was going to be moving on from this, and it was up to him to self-mythologize what this step in the Josh Wolff story meant and signified and how he explained it. And there was a noticeable public dearth of communication from his boss, from management, that kind of thing. We would get answers in press conferences where he would be asked if he had been having any conversations with Rodolfo or pre-court, and he would say, nope, no conversations at all. No communication whatsoever. If that was true, that isn't a great sign. And if it wasn't true, those conversations were already happening, and it was a figure out what your son who is still in the academy is going to do, start looking for another position. There are those sorts of things that they're not going to say publicly that are a part of what I understand to be the gentleman's agreement when it comes to this sort of thing, even if a coach is being dismissed with a win-loss draw record that looks the way that this did, and back-to-back playoff misses. There are those things that are bigger than football. So I am finally coming back around to what you asked. But
Good.
as we like to frame, context is key. The first thing I asked him was just pushing further on it sure didn't look like a friendly conversation between him and Greg Vanney. It sounded very much like that dog growling. It was the way that it came off last night. And he went for the fine and doubled, tripled down on the officiating not being great. And
Right. Which he usually is very careful about not doing.
Yeah, very much. That was very much a guy who was like, they can't extra fire me. They gonna hit the firing button harder or something? Come on. But watching the game last night, for some reason or another, when he initially told us whenever it was that his brother has cancer and has been undergoing treatment, it was something that my brain might have just deleted out or passed over or something like that. I don't think I initially clocked it. And in a recent midweek press availability, it was something that he mentioned off mic afterward when asked by, I think Colby said something or another about how often he gets out to go see his brother, that kind of a thing. But my younger brother had cancer, died of it about 14 years ago. And something like that, it's not something that I think Josh strategically deployed to try to curry sympathy or some like that. To me, it was more, look, this is where my head's at. This is what I think is a really serious big deal in real life. And there is a thing called real life outside of this. And there have been little comments along those lines that we've seen over the last weeks and months where there is more of that kind of introspection, I think, going on, that he is letting people know about, where he was always way more closed off than that he was giving any insight whatsoever into there being a human being inside the robot suit. Like, that would be notable.
I've been trying to ask him more too about just perspective and trying to put the season in context and his coaching in context. And he has been a little bit more willing to do that. Again, he still was talking in ways like somebody who was planning to be back next year, somebody who was going to keep coaching until he was told not to coach. But yeah, we have seen in recent weeks maybe this kind of realization that we were getting near the end of the tenure.
Taking that, I had been trying to formulate, when I feel like it's going to be the last time we talk to the guy officially through Austin FC, what shot am I going to shoot, anticipating that others will probably ask in different words, so you're definitely getting fired. How does that feel? And instead, I wanted to honestly take a note on what it seemed like he was willing to talk about, which is that there are things bigger than football. There are things outside of soccer. And I asked him for some insight as to the sacrifices, the struggles, the things that he is proud of his players that effectively give him an open-ended opportunity to say his piece, knowing that I probably wouldn't get those kinds of specifics, but that at least in generalities, give him an opportunity to say something to mark the end of his tenure without it coming off as, so give your own eulogy, welcome to your funeral, sir. And I exchanged a couple messages with a couple friends last night, and they were like, man, I can't believe he said that this wasn't the time or the right place for that kind of thing. And I was like, I got where he was coming from, and that was why I asked it in the first place. I knew that he wasn't going to answer what was an incredibly open-ended, give me a 45-minute answer kind of question. But what I did get, I feel like, got as much as I think was realistic at this juncture, at this point of things,
Did
for
talk a
just
little about
something.
relationships, about humanity, about connections with people in the club, and didn't give us specifics, but you have the sense that these are people that have enjoyed each other's presence. That again, I don't know how much the friendships are going to persist necessarily beyond this, but you do have a feeling that he has, at least for some of these players, left some sort of impression. You do get the sense that there's teaching going on, there's learning going on in both directions.
Yeah, and I don't want to either like dance on a grave or come off as here's the thing that people don't get about Josh Wolff. But
Right.
just for this moment in time, look, Phil, I don't know. Maybe you have been fired from a job. I know that I've been fired from a job. It's not a great feeling. And I think that to an extent, trying to give it as stoic of a view of things as possible while also validating the fact that this was always a weird culture fit from the beginning. This is a guy who comes from a generation of U.S. men's national team players who are not the most natural fit for a fan base Murga fueled that is South American styled, where if there is, I guess you would say, the hardcore era of US Mexico Dos Acero hardcore rivalry between the US way and the Latin American way. He
Mm.
definitely comes from, and this isn't me ascribing politics to him or anything like that, but that very
Right.
raw USA generation
Mhm.
that definitely has a certain association with what the default from the start vibes of the
Mhm.
fan base were. And I think that a
Right.
lot of the
Right.
conflict that we saw came out of that fundamental philosophical mismatch, which again, I'm not
Mhm.
ascribing blame or choosing a side or something aside from the fact that I know all the songs, love all the songs. So, what I hope is that on both sides of that divide, there is something positive and healing going forward. Because I think that even the hardest core of the Wolf Out folks can at least believe that it's good for things to go the way that they need to go for the betterment of
Mhm.
everybody, for the healing vibes that can hopefully happen. And I hope that wherever he lands next is more of a philosophical culture fit for him because not this is not a sport where you consciously want to go in creating a divide between your fan base and the coach.
Yeah. And again, it hasn't necessarily been 4 years of constant abject misery. There have been
Right.
good moments in there. He did figure out some really good things in the first two-thirds of 2022. Putting Musa Jite in the last 20 minutes of that RSL game was one of the better coaching moves that I've ever seen him make. I remember being impressed, asking him about that in the post-match press conference. But yeah, also not only is he from this kind of generation of US players, like you're saying, but he's also part of this Berhalter coaching tree. And this year you've seen Nico Estevez part ways with FC Dallas. You've seen Luchi Gonzalez part ways with San Jose. You've seen Greg Berhalter himself part ways with the U.S. men's national team. So you do have this kind of weird full circle thing coming with this style of coaching, with this approach where there's now this kind of reset. And again, Berhalter could end up easily coaching the fire. That's what the rumors are. I think Gonzalez and Estevez and Wolf are good enough to find other coaching jobs down the line. But again, I think there's going to be an interesting sort of juncture that's happening here with, again, now all four of these coaches essentially looking for work after having been coaches just earlier this year.
And I mean that the thing that has come up that I don't think is unfair at all is to look at the rigidity of the Berhalter ball and its derivations system.
Mhm.
And when we saw flexibility and change, whether it was entirely of Josh's volition or if it was something that came from above his head under Roto's direction, I think back to a game back in April that I went and watched from the stands that
Mhm.
it was the freedom for the players to actually execute a press. And the way that the
Mhm.
stadium lit up with energy
Yeah.
when it wasn't just triangle passes into infinity.
Is this the Galaxy game?
I believe that was the Galaxy game, the
Okay. Yeah.
Galaxy home game. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is the best they've looked all season.
The weird thing for me this season is that the further we get away from those earlier games in the season, I remember specific elements of them. And
Mhm.
because I can only have so many stress headaches, I forget some of the details. I don't want to go, wait a minute, what game was that? But I know that I can make a reference like that and you'll immediately pick it up. But something that I wanted to note is that before last night, the last time Seba Driussi had scored was the May 18th Protect the Legend Year of the Dragon Tifo game. And that there is that sort of a bookend to Driussi's season in advance of the decision day game, which is a bonus game, depending on how you look at it.
Thank you for this bonus. We really appreciate this bonus.
You know, there are things that will continue to be analyzed into infinity, but since coming up with this being the name of the podcast and the concept of the podcast and the general framing of it, we have had discussions about what do we do when, if, because eventually they would say goodbye to the coach, whether it was this season or eventually sometime down the line, and framing where things are so that we know that this is not the only Austin FC podcast in existence. We're able to draw a particular line in the sand, not to say that we're going to stop talking about the Josh Wolff tenure, because that's literally all of the data that there is in the club up to this point. But I think that putting a button on a few things bears doing. And the other thing that came to mind this morning in the 10 minutes of morning that were left when the music stopped playing, the thing that came to mind is there are, as I said, there are things outside of football. There is more than just than the coach being dismissed. A bunch of these players are on expiring contracts. They have options. We'll find out in the coming weeks which of those options maybe end up getting picked up that are optional and aren't auto triggered and that kind of thing. We have a press conference with the sporting director tomorrow, during which we will probably learn a whole bunch of stuff. And so this is more, let's get some of the stuff that we do know that we can talk about on the record and out the door before we learn the first step of what the next era of the club really is. Like this past year and a half of Roto being here has been a transitional phase. And the biggest thing that we learned with this morning's news is that we have another piece of validation that he sticks by what he says.
Yep. He did say playoffs were a must. And as soon as that didn't happen, this move happened. And again, if they were going to retain him, then yeah, he would have coached the home finale. I think that would have been really difficult for everybody. I think it's a really good move on the team's part, at least, to spare Josh, spare the fans, spare everybody the kind of rancor that was going to happen in that home finale if Josh was coaching it. Again, I think the fear would have been, yeah, he's coming back. And I think that fans were going to even more express themselves in terms of how they felt about that move. I think I do think in a way too that obviously it boils down to results, but I do think that fan frustration has been heard, and I think it is reflected in particular with what Precourt and Burrell said in the prepackaged quotes that were in the press release, which are up in my story as well, which I pre-wrote a few weeks ago thinking that this was going to indeed happen. So let's go ahead. We're going to wrap up real quick because we want you to listen to this hopefully on the way to the Verdos game. I hope that you guys are going to that. I'm going to be there. Moisés is going to be there. It should be fun to see joy and hope and possibly getting into the playoffs, which again, the first team is not giving us this year. Any final thoughts you got before we break here?
Just as we were getting ready to record this, people were posting screenshots of buying their season tickets, which just a few days ago or a couple days ago, they released availability for supporter section season tickets to Oak Collective waitlist members. And I saw 3 different people I don't know posting, okay, Austin, you done.
All right.
And they pulled the trigger on something that they were reluctant to.
And I think that's a consideration too. Yeah.
People were this morning saying, I will not set foot in the stadium again until he's gone, and drawing their own line of demarcation, and can call it dancing on someone's grave all you want, that there is goodwill to be gotten out of something this serious is something that should be noted.
Yep, for sure. All right. We're going to wrap it there. We'll hopefully be able to get to more tomorrow night once the Burrell press conference takes place. Moisés, you will be there, and we'll talk about that. And yeah, obviously lots of coverage to come in terms of coaches. And again, I do expect a lot of players possibly. And I don't think it's going to be quite the exodus as it was last year, but I do think that there are going to be some players that are exiting. I do think this team's going to look a little bit different than it did this year. And again, just thinking about what Burrell's going to do in the window, I think is going to be obviously the subject of much speculation.
And I think a lot of the ground that we've laid looking at a lot of the second team call ups and new acquisitions and that sort of thing, that'll give us fodder for speculation into the offseason as we look at the true transformation of the club into its next phase after its first 4 years. So, Phil, we haven't mentioned this to the audience, but it is something that we have certainly discussed. We have a hit to play one more time.
Okay, let's do it.
Where's Phil? He usually starts this off.
He's teaching in San Antonio today. Colby, go ahead and start us off.